The morning sun over Blackwood County didn't shine so much as it cut through the heavy, humid fog rising from the lowlands. Down at the end of Mill Creek Road, things had been quiet for 40 years, until the heavy machinery arrived. For 3 straight weeks, Arthur Vance watched from his porch as flatbed trucks hauled tons of crushed limestone and steel rebar past his property line, disappearing into the wooded valley owned by a private logging firm. But they weren't just harvesting timber. They were reshaping the earth. Arthur had spent his entire life working the land, and he knew what happens when you alter the natural slope of a valley. He knew the water had to go somewhere. He also knew that in Blackwood County, the law wasn't found in books, it was whatever Sheriff Thomas Miller said it was. When Arthur's basement filled with 2 feet of murky, silt-heavy runoff after a minor spring shower, he didn't panic. He did what any responsible citizen would do, he documented the damage, took clear photographs of the new, unpermitted access road blocking the natural drainage creek, and filed a formal code violation complaint with the Sheriff's Department. The response was a cold, brief, and dismissive silence. Sheriff Miller didn't just ignore the complaint, he actively filed it away in the bottom drawer of a locked cabinet, assuming a retired farmer would eventually tire of complaining and let the matter drop. What the sheriff failed to realize was that some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed by political influence or local intimidation. The contrast between the 2 men couldn't have been starker. Sheriff Miller operated on a system of handshakes, unwritten agreements, and old boy networks that had governed the rural county for generations. To him, the logging company represented jobs, campaign contributions, and a hands-off approach to local commerce. Arthur Vance, on the other hand, represented the old way, a belief that rules applied equally to everyone. Whether you own 10,000 acres or a modest 3-bedroom farmhouse. When Arthur walked into the precinct 2 weeks later to follow up on his filed complaint, the atmosphere was thick with professional indifference. The deputy at the front desk didn't look up from his computer screen, merely gesturing toward the hallway where the sheriff stood, deep in conversation with a representative from the timber firm. When Arthur approached, showing the updated photographs of his crumbling foundation and the diverted creek bed, Miller didn't even look at the prints. He simply patted Arthur on the shoulder, his voice dripping with a calculated, patronizing warmth. He told Arthur that the county was going through a period of necessary modernization, that nature sometimes takes its course, and that a little water in a basement was a civil matter, not a criminal one. He advised Arthur to buy a stronger sump pump and leave the county planning to the professionals. But the law of physics doesn't care about local political alliances. Gravity dictates that water flows downward, seeking the path of least resistance, and the new logging road had effectively turned Arthur's northern property line into a localized flood zone. Realizing the sheriff's department was an absolute dead end, Arthur didn't back down. Instead, he shifted his strategy from local law enforcement to municipal infrastructure. He drove 30 miles to the county seat, walked past the sheriff's office entirely, and entered the Department of Public Works. There, sitting behind a desk piled high with blueprints, topographical maps, and strict state regulatory manuals, was the county engineer, Marcus Vance, no relation to Arthur, but a man who shared his absolute obsession with structural integrity and the rule of law. Marcus wasn't a politician, he was a licensed civil engineer bound by state statutes and professional liability. When Arthur laid the photographs on his desk alongside a copy of the county's own stormwater management ordinance, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Marcus didn't offer a patronizing pat on the back. He put on his reading glasses, pulled up the county's geographic information system maps, and began cross-referencing the coordinates of the new logging road. Within 5 minutes, the engineer's face turned grim. The logging company hadn't just built an access road, they had completely filled in a designated blue line stream, a protected natural waterway under both county and state jurisdiction. The sheriff had treated the situation as a minor, localized dispute between neighbors that could be buried with a little social pressure. Marcus saw it for what it truly was, an illegal, unpermitted structural modification that threatened the entire structural integrity of the county's secondary road network. If the creek remained blocked during a heavy downpour, the water wouldn't just flood Arthur's basement, it would pool against the earthen embankment of Mill Creek Road itself, creating a hydrostatic pressure cook that could trigger a catastrophic road washout. The logging company had bypassed the mandatory engineering review process entirely, likely with a quiet nod of approval from the sheriff's office, assuming nobody with actual authority would ever bother to drive out to the lowlands to check the work. They underestimated the administrative duty of the county engineer. Marcus closed his laptop, grabbed his yellow high-visibility vest, his digital surveyor's level, and his official state vehicle keys. He looked at Arthur and told him to head back home. The time for filing complaints on paper was officially over. The county engineer was coming to conduct a formal, legally binding on-site inspection, and under state law, not even the sheriff had the authority to stand in his way when a public asset was actively placed at risk. The gravel rattled violently against the undercarriage of the county engineer's white utility truck as it pulled up to the edge of Arthur's property line. Marcus stepped out of the vehicle, his steel-toed boots sinking slightly into the saturated, spongy earth that now characterized Arthur's front yard. He didn't say a word at first. He simply unrolled a large, laminated topographical map across the hood of his truck and weighted the corners down with a couple of heavy brass survey markers. Arthur stood a few feet back, watching as the engineer began using a handheld laser rangefinder to measure the distance between the newly constructed logging embankment and the edge of the public county easement. The contrast between the sheriff's lazy, dismissive attitude and Marcus's precise, methodical movements was total. Where the sheriff saw an old man complaining about mud, the engineer saw a ticking mathematical time bomb. Every calculation Marcus made confirmed his worst fears. The logging company had built an unreinforced earthen berm directly across a natural culvert, completely disregarding the county's strict stormwater management criteria. They had essentially constructed an unpermitted, structurally unsound dam right above a public roadway, using nothing but loose topsoil and crushed limestone that was already beginning to erode under the constant pressure of the subsurface water table. As Marcus adjusted his digital surveyor's level on its tripod, the distinct sound of a V8 engine echoed down the valley. Within minutes, a black Ford Expedition with the Blackwood County Sheriff's decal slid to a halt right next to the engineer's truck. Sheriff Thomas Miller climbed out, his aviator sunglasses reflecting the gray afternoon sky, his hand resting casually near his duty belt. He didn't look at Arthur at all, his eyes were fixed entirely on Marcus. Miller smiled, but it was a rigid, defensive expression that didn't reach his eyes. He asked Marcus what the Department of Public Works was doing performing unannounced field inspections in a zone that his deputies had already cleared earlier that week. The conflict between the two men was no longer about a flooded basement, it was a direct clash between old-school political intimidation and modern administrative authority. Sheriff Miller attempted to de-escalate the situation by framing the entire dispute as a minor misunderstanding between private landowners that didn't require official county intervention. He explicitly stated that the logging firm had promised to repair any peripheral damage once their seasonal operations were concluded, and that pushing the issue now would only tie up local businesses in unnecessary bureaucratic red tape. Marcus didn't blink. He reached into his truck, pulled out a heavy-bound volume of the State Transportation and Infrastructure Code, and laid it open on the hood right next to his maps. He pointed directly to Section 404, which clearly dictated that any unauthorized modification to a designated blue line stream or public drainage easement constituted an immediate, non-discretionary threat to public safety. Marcus looked the sheriff dead in the eye and explained, in calm, measured tones, that this wasn't a civil matter. The logging company's unpermitted construction had already caused significant hydrostatic pressure to build up against the foundational support structures of Mill Creek Road. If another heavy rain system hit the county before the drainage was restored, the entire public roadway would likely suffer a structural failure, costing the county taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars in emergency reconstruction fees. The engineer made it absolutely clear that as the licensed civil official responsible for the county's infrastructure, he was legally obligated to issue an immediate, mandatory stop work order and a notice of violation to the property owners, regardless of who had given them informal permission to build there in the first place. The sheriff's patronizing demeanor evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, bureaucratic defensiveness. He reminded Marcus that the logging company was the largest employer in Blackwood County and that halting their operations, even for a few days, would cause significant economic disruption that the county commissioners would not appreciate. Miller subtly implied that an engineer who caused too many problems for local industry might find his department's budget severely scrutinized during the next fiscal review cycle. It was a classic local power play, the kind of implicit threat that had kept most county employees falling in line for decades. But Marcus wasn't a typical county employee. His professional engineering license was issued by the state, and his legal liabilities could not be overridden by a local law enforcement official. He informed the sheriff that failing to report a known structural hazard to the State Department of Transportation would result in the immediate forfeiture of his professional credentials and expose the county to massive civil lawsuits. Marcus pulled out his official citation book, filled out the paperwork with precise, unhurried penmanship, and walked right past the sheriff to post the bright red, weather-resistant stop work order directly onto the logging company's security gate. The bright red tag attached to the logging company's security gate fluttered violently in the rising wind, a stark symbol of defiance against the established power dynamics of Blackwood County. Sheriff Miller watched the engineer walk back to his utility vehicle, his expression hardening into a look of absolute administrative rage. The sheriff knew that a formal, state-registered stop work order was completely different from a standard local code complaint. It created an official, indelible digital paper trail that reached far beyond the county lines, straight into the state capitol's regulatory databases. For years, the sheriff had managed to keep all local disputes contained within his own sphere of influence, resolving problems through quiet favors and selective enforcement. Now, a stubborn farmer and a meticulous engineer had bypassed his authority entirely, threatening to expose the legal shortcuts he had permitted the logging company to take. Miller stepped directly into Marcus's path, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper, warning the engineer that he was overstepping his bounds and disrupting a project that had been greenlit by the highest levels of local government. Marcus didn't flinch, nor did he raise his voice. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out his state-issued credentials alongside his smartphone, which was already displaying a live data feed from the state's regional hydrological monitoring station. The contrast between the sheriff's physical, aggressive posturing and the engineer's calm, data-driven precision was absolute. Marcus pointed to the screen, showing the sheriff that the water levels in the subterranean aquifer beneath Arthur's property had risen by nearly 40% in less than 72 hours due to the blocked stream. He explained, with the detached clarity of a math teacher, that under State Revised Statute 611, any public official who knowingly interferes with an emergency infrastructure inspection or attempts to suppress a documented public safety hazard can be held personally liable for both criminal negligence and official misconduct. He made it perfectly clear that if the sheriff refused to enforce the stop work order, Marcus would immediately contact the state attorney general's Environmental Crimes Division to report the obstruction. Faced with a direct, legally unassailable challenge to his authority, Sheriff Miller realized he could no longer use simple intimidation to bury the problem. He let out a harsh, cynical laugh, climbed back into his black expedition, and slammed the door, tearing away down the muddy road and leaving a thick cloud of exhaust and gravel in his wake. Arthur Vance watched the cruiser disappear before turning to the engineer, a look of profound relief washing over his weathered face. For weeks, he had been made to feel like he was the crazy one, an old man imagining problems where none existed. Seeing a county official validate his fears with maps, instruments, and the full weight of state law was a vindication he hadn't expected to witness. But Marcus wasn't celebrating. He knew that issuing an order was only the first step in a very long, very ugly bureaucratic war. The logging company had millions of dollars invested in the timber harvest, and they weren't going to let a piece of red paper stop their bulldozers for long without a fight. Within 2 hours of the notice being posted, the legal machinery of the logging conglomerate roared to life. A corporate attorney from the state capitol filed an emergency injunction request with the county circuit court, claiming that the Department of Public Works had acted arbitrarily, without sufficient empirical evidence, and had caused the company thousands of dollars in unrecoverable daily operational losses. The company's legal strategy was simple: tie the engineer up in rapid-fire administrative hearings, use political pressure to force the county commissioners to rescind the order, and keep digging until the road was finished. They assumed that a rural county engineer wouldn't have the resources or the stamina to defend his calculations in a formal courtroom setting. What they failed to anticipate was that Marcus had spent his entire career preparing for exactly this kind of corporate bullying. He didn't rely on guesswork or vague observations. He had a complete, mathematically flawless record of every cubic yard of displaced soil, every gallon of diverted water, and every structural defect in the public roadway. The next morning, a mandatory emergency meeting was called at the Blackwood County Courthouse. The small, wood-paneled conference room was packed with tension. On one side of the long mahogany table sat the logging company's high-priced legal team, flanked by Sheriff Miller, who sat with his arms crossed, projecting an air of smug confidence. On the other side sat Marcus, completely alone, with nothing but his laptop, 3 3-ring binders of technical data, and a physical core sample of the saturated soil he had taken from Arthur's property line. The head corporate attorney opened the meeting with a blistering attack on Marcus's professional conduct, accusing him of executing a personal vendetta against local business owners and exceeding his statutory authority by halting a project that had received prior verbal clearances from local law enforcement. The attorney demanded the immediate lifting of the stop work order and a formal apology from the department, implying that a massive civil lawsuit for damages against Marcus personally was already drafted and ready for filing if the order wasn't rescinded by noon. The corporate attorney leaned forward, tapping his expensive gold pen against the mahogany table to emphasize his point. He looked directly at the 3 county commissioners sitting at the head of the table, reminding them of the thousands of dollars in tax revenue the logging company brought into Blackwood County every single month. He argued that Marcus's stop work order was based entirely on visual speculation, a knee-jerk reaction to a disgruntled local farmer who simply didn't want to see trees cut down near his property. Sheriff Miller nodded in agreement, adding that his deputies had walked the site and found absolutely no evidence of criminal property damage or immediate public hazard. To the commissioners, who were caught between the desire for corporate investment and the fear of a massive lawsuit, the situation looked like a messy, subjective dispute that could be quietly settled by rewriting a few local permits. They looked toward Marcus, expecting the young engineer to back down, offer a compromise, or ask for a multi-week postponement to gather more data. Instead, Marcus stood up, adjusted his glasses, and opened his first 3-ring binder. He didn't offer an emotional defense, nor did he argue about corporate greed. He simply turned on his digital projector, displaying a high-resolution, side-by-side comparison of the county's official hydrological maps from the past 3 decades alongside satellite imagery captured just 48 hours prior. The contrast between the lawyer's slick, aggressive rhetoric and Marcus's cold, unassailable scientific evidence was devastating. He pointed to the screen, showing the exact coordinates where the logging company's bulldozers had filled in the Blue Line stream. Marcus didn't just claim the road was a hazard, he proved it using fluid dynamics calculations and hydrostatic pressure metrics derived directly from state engineering manuals. He demonstrated that by blocking the natural culvert, the company had forced over 50,000 gallons of daily subsurface water runoff to pool directly against the structural subbase of Mill Creek Road, lowering its load-bearing capacity by over 60%. The room grew completely silent as Marcus flipped to the next section of his binder, which contained the physical core sample data he had gathered the previous afternoon. He explained that the soil beneath the public roadway was already exhibiting signs of advanced liquefaction, a geological phenomenon where saturated soil loses its strength and behaves like a liquid, completely undermining whatever structure sits on top of it. He looked directly at the county commissioners and stated, for the record, that if a heavy commercial vehicle, such as one of the logging company's own fully loaded timber trucks, were to drive down Mill Creek Road under these current conditions, the asphalt would likely collapse into a sinkhole, potentially causing a fatal accident. Marcus then pulled out a certified copy of State Code Section 102, which explicitly established that if a county commission knowingly votes to rescind a public safety order after being presented with empirical engineering proof of a structural hazard, individual commissioners lose their qualified immunity and become personally liable for any resulting property damage, injury, or loss of life. The smug confidence vanished from the corporate attorney's face. He looked over at Sheriff Miller, expecting some form of political backup, but the sheriff was staring intently at the table, realizing that the engineer had completely shifted the legal landscape. Marcus had taken the argument out of the realm of local politics and placed it squarely into the realm of personal financial liability and state regulatory law. The county commissioners, suddenly realizing that their own personal assets and political careers were on the line, looked at each other in visible panic. The head commissioner cleared his throat, completely changing his tone, and asked Marcus what specific corrective actions were required to safely resolve the situation. Marcus didn't hesitate. He stated that the stop work order would remain in place until the logging company hired a licensed, independent engineering firm to design and construct a fully permitted, reinforced concrete culvert system to permanently restore the natural flow of the creek, all at the company's sole expense. The corporate legal team sat frozen, their expensive pens suspended in the air as the full weight of Marcus's presentation settled over the room. The threat of a massive lawsuit against the county had completely backfired. Instead, the logging firm was now facing the terrifying prospect of infinite civil and criminal liability if they pushed forward and caused a catastrophic infrastructure collapse. The head commissioner didn't even call for a formal vote. He looked directly at the logging company's lead attorney and told him, in no uncertain terms, that Blackwood County would not lift the stop work order until every single engineering requirement outlined by Marcus was met to the letter, verified by independent inspectors, and signed off by the Department of Public Works. Sheriff Miller watched his political capital evaporate in real time, realizing that his years of running the county as a personal fiefdom had hit an insurmountable wall of mathematical fact and state statute. He quietly gathered his hat from the table and slipped out the back door of the conference room before the meeting was even formally adjourned. Back on Mill Creek Road, the silence that returned to the valley was profound. The heavy bulldozers stood idle behind the locked security gate, their massive steel blades resting in the mud, neutralized not by a physical force, but by the power of a legally binding piece of red paper. 2 days later, a commercial flatbed arrived, not to haul more illegal limestone, but to deliver a massive, precast concrete culvert section. Under the watchful eye of Marcus, who stood on the embankment with his clipboard and surveyor's level, the logging company's contractors began the painstaking process of excavating the unpermitted earthen dam. They worked around the clock, digging out the crushed stone that had choked the valley, carefully restoring the original, natural pathway of the Blue Line stream. As the earth was cleared away, the trapped, muddy water that had been pooling against Arthur Vance's property line finally found its release, rushing through the new concrete channel with a loud, cleansing roar. Arthur stood on his front porch, watching the water recede from his yard for the first time in nearly a month. The basement floor was finally drying out, the hydrostatic pressure against his foundation walls relieved by the engineered drainage system. He looked down the road and saw the white utility truck parked by the easement, where Marcus was performing his final structural inspection of the completed culvert. The contrast between how the conflict began, with a dismissive sheriff throwing a citizen's complaint into a dark drawer, and how it ended was a powerful testament to the true nature of authority. Real power didn't belong to the man with a badge who thought he could ignore the rules, it belonged to the citizen who refused to be intimidated, and the dedicated civil servant who used the precise, unyielding instruments of the law to protect the public infrastructure. Blackwood County would never be exactly the same after that spring. The Old Boy Network had been exposed to the light of regulatory accountability, and the paper trail in the mud had permanently rewritten the rules of the land.